The rope creaked as it descended into the black mouth of the churchyard well, each turn of the crank groaning under the weight it carried. Lanterns swayed in the damp night air, casting sickly yellow light across the gathered faces pale, not from cold, but from what they knew they were about to see. The water's surface was still when they found him, as if reluctant to give him back. When his small body broke through, the crowd gasped as one. Elijah was 13 years old. His eyes were open, glassy, reflecting the lamplight in a way that made it look like he was still watching them. His fingers were locked around a small brass church key, its ornate handle wet and dark with something thicker than water. And though he had been in the well for hours, maybe longer, his shoes were completely dry. If you've just joined us, this is a story you will not want to turn away from. And before we go further, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who won't sleep tonight, subscribe and press the bell so you never miss when we bring you the darkest, true tales history tried to bury. Because what you're about to hear has been hidden for nearly a century and a half, and it begins right here. The men who pulled Elijah from the well were silent at first. The only sound was the slow drip of water falling from his coat into the mud. Then someone whispered a prayer, and another followed, until it spread like a murmur through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer, as if the boy's still form might somehow reach for them. The preacher, his father, stood a few steps back, face unreadable, one hand resting on the handle of his cane. He did not cry. He did not speak. He only looked at the key in his son's hand, his lips tightening as if against a bitter taste. The sheriff ordered the crowd to give space, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles around the well. He knelt beside the boy, brushing a strand of wet hair from his face. "Shoes are dry," he muttered, not expecting an answer. But in a small town, everything is overheard. The words spread back through the onlookers until they reached the edge of the yard. By the time they came back to him, they were already something more. The boy couldn't have fallen in. Lantern light caught on the key again, drawing eyes to it. It was no ordinary key, polished brass with an ornate bow in the shape of a cross. Every man, woman, and child in that crowd had seen it before. It was the key to the well's lock, kept for as long as anyone could remember by the preacher himself. The church had built the well decades earlier, not for drinking water, but for baptisms and holy blessings. It had been sealed and locked to keep it pure, opened only for the most sacred rites. No one outside the church carried a key. No one. The air in the yard thickened. The sheriff glanced at the preacher, who stared back without flinching. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the preacher stepped forward, his voice low, measured. "The key was stolen," he said. No one asked by whom. 2 boys were sent to fetch a blanket, but by the time they returned, Elijah had already been lifted and carried toward the parsonage. His head lolled against the sheriff's arm, the brass key still clutched tightly in one small hand. The preacher walked behind them, his steps slow, deliberate. The crowd parted without a word, watching them pass like a funeral procession in the dark. The rain began just as they reached the steps, soft at first, then heavy enough to send the rest of the townsfolk scattering toward their homes. Only a few lingered, those who had seen the boy that day and wanted to know more, those who had heard strange things from their windows at night, those who feared they already knew the truth. Inside, the sheriff laid Elijah on the parlor settee, the water pooling beneath him. The preacher's wife, pale and thin, appeared from the hallway. She looked at her son for only a second before retreating into the shadows without a word. The sheriff frowned but said nothing. Instead, he reached for the key in Elijah's hand. It did not come easily. He had to pry the boy's fingers apart, each one stiff and cold, until the key slipped free. The metal was warm, unnaturally so, considering where it had been. He turned it over in his palm, noting a faint reddish smear along the teeth. "Where did you find it?" he asked the preacher. "I told you," came the reply. "It was stolen, and now it's returned." There was something in the way he said it, final, unyielding, that made the sheriff feel as though the matter was closed in the preacher's mind, no matter what the law might say. But the law was not the only power in Nashville in 1879. The church held its own court, its own judgments, and in this town, those judgments were rarely questioned. The sheriff placed the key on the mantel, its cross-shaped bow catching the firelight. For a moment, it looked like a crucifix. He found himself wondering if that was intentional. From the corner of the room came the faint sound of dripping water. He turned toward it, but saw nothing, just the parlor's shadowed walls and the closed door beyond. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to echo inside his head. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. When he turned back to the settee, Elijah's face seemed different somehow, not in expression, but in the way his eyes caught the light, as if something in them had shifted. That night, the sheriff could not sleep. Rain hammered the roof, and every so often he thought he could hear the crank of the well's pulley, the groan of its rope straining against a weight. Once, near midnight, he rose and looked out towards the churchyard. Through the mist, he could just make out the well, its shape hunched in the dark like something alive. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, small and deliberate, circling it. But when lightning flashed, the yard was empty. By morning, the story had already begun to twist. Some said Elijah had been seen walking toward the well in his Sunday clothes hours after sundown. Others claimed they heard him singing, though the words were in no hymn they knew. And a few, those who remembered the old stories whispered by grandparents, spoke of the well not as a place for water, but as a gate, a threshold, a place where things could be given away or taken. Whatever the truth was, it was clear to the sheriff that the well had not given up all it held, and neither, it seemed, had the preacher. Nashville in 1879 was not the city it would become. It was smaller, quieter, its streets more dust than brick, its skyline broken by the steeples of churches rather than the smoke of industry. Wooden storefronts lined the main road, their painted signs weathered by years of southern sun and sudden storms. The air carried the mingled smells of horse sweat, coal oil, and the faint sweetness of magnolia when the wind turned just right. People knew each other's names here, and more importantly, they knew each other's business, or thought they did. It was a place where the church bell told the hours as surely as any clock, and the preacher's word weighed more than a judge's. The preacher of the First Baptist Church of Nashville was a man named Reverend Isaiah Cole. Tall, with a voice that could fill a room without strain, he had come to the city 12 years earlier, a widower with a small child and a reputation for unbending faith. The church was not much then, a simple wooden frame, pews built from rough pine. But under his leadership it had grown into a stone sanctuary with arched windows imported from St. Louis and a bell cast in Boston. He had overseen every nail, every stone, every sermon, shaping the church as one might shape a child. But behind the walls of the churchyard, at its far edge, near the line of sycamores, there stood something older than Reverend Cole's tenure. The well. Its stones were dark with age, some rounded smooth by time, others chipped and sharp. A carved cross stood over its arch, and an iron lid sealed its mouth. It had been dug decades before, not to serve the town's thirst, but for sacred purpose, drawn upon only for baptisms, for mixing the anointing oil, for the rare blessing of crops during drought. The water was considered pure, blessed, and untouchable except by the preacher's hand. For as long as anyone could remember, the well had been locked, the key hanging in the preacher's study like a relic, until Elijah was found with it clutched in his hand. The night of his death spread across town in whispers, and with it came the question everyone tried not to say aloud. How had the boy reached the water? The well was more than 6 feet deep before water began, and its lid could not be lifted without unlocking the heavy crossbar. Children dared one another to touch the iron, but none had the courage to linger. And yet the preacher's son had been pulled from it, his clothes damp, his shoes dry. In the days following the boy's death, Nashville moved as though under a heavy fog. The butcher's laughter in the mornings grew quieter. The children playing near the livery stable no longer sang. Even the tavern across from the church, known for its piano music at all hours, seemed muted. The preacher still climbed the pulpit on Sunday, still spoke of sin and salvation, but his voice was strained, as though each word cost him. No mention of Elijah's death passed his lips in public, not even to offer comfort. In a town so tightly wound by faith, this silence was more unsettling than any grief. The sheriff, Thomas Hale, was a man of the old order, broad-shouldered, slow to speak, with a manner that made people confess things they hadn't meant to. He had been in Nashville since before the war, had seen the city occupied, freed, and rebuilt. He had buried 2 sons of his own to illness, and he carried their memory in the set of his jaw. Hale had known Elijah since birth, had once bounced him on his knee in the shade of the courthouse. Now, each time he walked the street, he felt the weight of eyes on him, watching, waiting for the law to say something the church would not. The preacher's wife, Margaret Cole, was less a fixture in the community. Born to a family from Savannah, she had met the Reverend during one of his early preaching tours. Illness had kept her frail since before Elijah's birth, and she was rarely seen outside the parsonage except on the warmest of Sundays. Those who knew her spoke kindly of her quiet grace, though some whispered she had grown colder in recent years, retreating further into the dim rooms of the house. After the boy's death, she vanished entirely from sight. In a place like Nashville, the church was not only a house of God, it was the courthouse, the newspaper, the school. A good word from the preacher could open a man's business. A poor one could close it. Men sought his counsel before making major decisions. Women looked to his wife for the proper way to receive guests. And so, when tragedy struck his family, the town's reaction was not only sympathy, it was confusion. This was not the sort of thing that happened to the righteous. It was a story out of order, a note sung off-key. Some townsfolk turned to older stories to make sense of it. They spoke of the well in hushed voices, recalling tales their grandparents told, about how it had once been dug to replace an older one that had collapsed, and how the land beneath it was strange. The ground there never froze, even in the coldest winter, and no matter how much water was drawn, it never seemed to run low. One man claimed his grandfather had seen something in it, a reflection that wasn't his own. Another insisted that if you listened at night, you could hear the sound of someone knocking from inside the stones. The church dismissed these tales as superstition, but they clung to the edges of conversation now, growing with each retelling. The preacher himself offered no account of his son's final hours. When Sheriff Hale pressed him in private, he gave the same answer he had the night Elijah was pulled from the water. The key had been stolen. No, he did not know by whom. No, he could not say when. Yes, he had searched for it. And yes, he believed God's will was at work, even in this. He said the words with such calm certainty that Hale left the meeting more unsettled than before. It was during one of his walks along the main road that Hale overheard something that tightened the knot in his stomach. 2 young women, both members of the congregation, spoke in low tones outside the milliner's shop. One said she had seen Elijah near the church after the Wednesday service the week before he died. She had been walking home when she heard a sound, singing, but not the hymns they knew. When she turned the corner, she saw him standing at the well with his head bent, as if listening. The other woman shushed her quickly, glancing toward the church as though the building itself might overhear. That image stayed with Hale, the boy alone at the well, listening to something no one else could hear. He began to consider the possibility that Elijah had gone there willingly. But if so, why? And how did he have the key? By the week's end, the parsonage shutters were drawn, the well stood locked again, and the town returned to its uneasy rhythm. The streets bustled during the day, but conversations dropped when certain names were mentioned. In the tavern, men spoke of crops and weather, not of the boy in the well. In the pews, women kept their eyes on the preacher, not on the empty place in the front row where Elijah had once sat. The absence was its own presence. It lived in the way the church bell seemed heavier when it tolled, in the way the wind hissed through the sycamores by the well. It lived in the eyes of the sheriff each time he passed the parsonage, knowing that behind those drawn curtains was a man who had lost his son in a place meant to bless, not to bury. And in Nashville, 1879, that was something no one knew how to speak of. At least not yet. Elijah Cole was a boy who seemed to exist in the spaces between other people's lives. He was present, but quiet, a figure on the edge of the schoolyard games, a shadow at the back of the Sunday school class. At 13, he was neither tall nor short, his build slight but wiry, with the same dark hair and pale skin as his mother. His eyes were a gray that could appear almost blue in sunlight, though few noticed. He rarely met anyone's gaze for long. Most in town described him as well-behaved, in that polite, distant way reserved for children who never caused trouble but never seemed to laugh much either. His days followed a rigid rhythm. At dawn, he would fetch kindling for the parsonage stove, then sit at the kitchen table with his mother for morning devotions. She would read softly from the worn leather Bible her own mother had given her, her voice thin but steady, while Elijah traced the lines of the text with one finger. Breakfast was plain, porridge or bread with a little molasses, before his father called him to assist with the day's church tasks. This might mean sweeping the nave, polishing the brass candlesticks, or carrying water from the pump to fill the wash basin in the vestry. He never complained, though there was no joy in it either. The boy carried out his duties with the same solemnity as a grown man fulfilling an obligation. In the afternoons, he attended lessons at the small schoolhouse on Cedar Street. His handwriting was neat, his arithmetic careful, but his answers in class were so quiet the teacher often had to ask him to repeat himself. The other children tolerated him without warmth. He was the preacher's son, after all, and carried with him the invisible weight of his father's authority. Some boys tried to draw him into their games of tag or marbles, but Elijah seemed reluctant, as if play itself was something he had been told was dangerous. After school, he would walk home alone, head down, as though following a path only he could see. In the weeks before his death, small changes began to creep into this routine. Changes most dismissed at the time as the ordinary strangeness of a growing boy. One of the school teachers, Miss Carter, noticed him staring out the window during lessons, his lips moving as though silently repeating words. When she asked what he was saying, he flushed and muttered, "Nothing, ma'am." A farmer's son swore he saw Elijah near the old sycamores by the churchyard after sunset, even though the boy was supposed to be home. Another child claimed Elijah had been humming a tune during recess, a slow, winding melody no one recognized. When pressed, Elijah refused to sing it again. Inside the parsonage, there were other signs. His mother found him one night at the kitchen table long after she thought he was asleep, sketching circles and shapes on scraps of paper. They were not pictures exactly, more like symbols, repeating over and over as if he were practicing a secret alphabet. When she asked what they meant, he covered the paper with his hand and said, "It's for the well." She told him not to speak of such foolishness, but his face closed off like a door being shut. and he left the table without another word. Reverend Cole was a strict father, though not cruel. His discipline was precise and controlled, delivered with the same tone he used from the pulpit. When Elijah erred, forgot a chore, spoke out of turn, his father would correct him firmly, often making him recite scripture related to obedience or humility. Yet there were moments when the preacher's sternness gave way to something more guarded, as though he were watching for signs of something unspoken. The Reverend seemed to study his son the way a physician might study a patient for symptoms. It was a quiet, unsettling vigilance. Margaret Cole's relationship with her son was different, quieter still, almost fragile. She moved through the house like a shadow, conserving her strength, but her eyes softened whenever Elijah entered the room. She would touch his hair or straighten his collar with a tenderness that seemed to surprise him. In her presence he was less guarded, though still careful. He would linger at her bedside when she was ill, reading aloud from the Psalms, his voice low and deliberate. But even she admitted to the sheriff later that in the final days before his death, there was something in him she did not recognize, an absence behind his eyes, as if part of him had gone somewhere else. Neighbors had their own observations. Mrs. Whitlow, who lived across from the church, said she saw him sitting on the steps of the well one morning, dangling his feet over the edge as if it were nothing more dangerous than a porch stoop. She called to him, but he did not answer, just looked down into the dark. She told him to get away from there before his father saw, but he rose slowly, walked back toward the parsonage, and never once looked over his shoulder. A week before the tragedy, Nashville had been struck by a sudden storm. The wind came in hard from the west, bringing rain that fell in thick sheets, flooding the gutters and turning the road to mud. That night, Elijah disappeared from his bed. His mother, thinking he had gone to the privy, waited, but when he did not return, she went searching. She found him outside in the rain, standing barefoot on the churchyard grass, staring at the well. His nightshirt was plastered to his skin, but his feet were clean, as though he had stepped directly onto the wet earth from somewhere else. She led him inside, trembling more from the look in his eyes than from the cold. He told her then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, "It wants me to come down." When she asked what wanted him, he said, "The water." She slapped him, not hard, but enough to break the moment, and told him never to speak of it again. He didn't. Not to her. In the days that followed, Elijah became even more withdrawn. At supper, he would eat mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. Once, Margaret caught him standing at the window in the middle of the night, whispering to himself. She strained to hear the words, but could make out only fragments. "After the bells, when it's quiet, bring the key." When she told her husband, he dismissed it as dreaming. If there was one place where Elijah seemed entirely himself, it was in the choir loft on Sundays. His voice, though not strong, carried a clear, pure tone that blended easily with the others. Yet even here, something shifted. On the last Sunday before his death, during the closing hymn, he did not sing the words written on the page. Those near him said his lips moved to a different rhythm, shaping syllables they did not recognize, his eyes fixed not on the congregation or the cross, but on the closed door that led to the churchyard. By then, the well had already entered his life in ways no one understood. Whether he was drawn to it, or it to him, no one could say. All they knew was that Elijah Cole, the preacher's son, had begun to change. And in Nashville, changes like that were rarely without cause. Sheriff Thomas Hale began his inquiry the morning after Elijah's body was pulled from the well. He moved quietly, without the formalities of an inquest, knowing that in a town like Nashville, the truth had to be coaxed from shadows rather than demanded in daylight. The official record would say little, The church had a way of keeping certain matters from the paper. But Hale had buried 2 sons of his own and knew the hollow sound a home made when death had passed through it. And he knew that in this case the sound was wrong, too sharp, too restrained, as if grief had been locked behind a door. He started with those who had been at the churchyard the night before. Most swore they had seen nothing until the alarm was raised, until that first cry of "the boys in the well" cut up through the evening air. Yet, as he walked from one porch to the next, details began to emerge in fragments. Mrs. Whitlow admitted she'd heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her house earlier that night, well after dark. She'd assumed it was a stray dog or one of the neighbor boys. A farmhand named Curtis claimed he saw a small figure crossing the yard behind the church an hour before the discovery, moving quickly but without a lantern. When he called out, the figure didn't answer. The well itself was the most troubling part of the scene. Hale knew its lock. Every man in town did. Heavy iron, crossbar secured with a brass mechanism that required a deliberate turn of the key. When he first approached it that night, the lid had been propped open, resting against the side of the stone wall. The key, as they all saw, had been clutched in Elijah's dead hand. But the well had not been forced. The bar was intact, the lock unbroken. Whoever had opened it had done so the proper way. That left 2 possibilities. Either Elijah had somehow taken the key without his father's knowledge, or someone with permission, or at least access, had given it to him. When Hale returned to the parsonage that morning, the preacher was in his study, a Bible open before him. The key's absence had been explained the night before with the single word, stolen. Hale pressed him for details. The Reverend leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over the open scripture. "I keep it here," he said, nodding toward the wall where a wooden peg stood empty. "2 days ago, I saw it was missing. I assumed one of the elders had taken it for a baptism or some other preparation. When I asked, no one claimed it. And now—" He trailed off, eyes settling on the floor. Hale pointed out that no baptism had been scheduled. The preacher's jaw tightened. "I am telling you what I know, Sheriff. Beyond that, I will not speculate. My son is gone, and that is grief enough without weaving stories." It was not enough for Hale. He asked to search the church. The Reverend hesitated, then agreed. Together they walked across the yard, the wet grass clinging to their boots. Inside, the nave was dim, the morning light filtering through stained glass in fractured colors. The air was cool and smelled faintly of oil and old wood. Hale moved through each aisle, opening cabinets, checking the vestry. He found the second well key hanging in its usual place, undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints beyond the usual scuff of shoes on the wooden floor. It was as if nothing at all had happened, except, of course, for the boy at the bottom of the well. Back outside, Hale examined the ground around the well. The rain from the previous days had softened the earth, and any footprints near the lip were blurred. Still, he noted one small impression on the southern side, narrow and deep at the heel, the kind made by a child's shoe. He followed it a few feet before it vanished into the grass. The well's stonework was slick with moisture, but when he leaned over and shone his lantern down, the walls below the waterline appeared darker, as if something had been smeared there. He could not tell if it was silt, algae, or something else entirely. By midday, word of the investigation had drawn curious onlookers. People lingered near the fence, speaking in low voices. Hale caught snippets as he passed. He went down himself. Wasn't right in the head lately. Maybe it's God's judgment. No one spoke openly against the preacher, but there was a tension in the air, the kind that came when faith and doubt began to occupy the same space. That evening, a new piece of evidence surfaced. A young boy named Samuel, whose father worked as the church sexton, came to Hale's door clutching a crumpled scrap of paper. He said he had found it 2 nights earlier near the sycamores, on the path leading to the well. It was a torn page from a hymn book, damp and smudged, but still legible. The hymn was Deep River, an old spiritual about crossing over into the Promised Land. In the margin, written in a thin, deliberate hand, were the words, "The deep calls to the deep." Samuel swore he had not seen Elijah write it, but he recognized the handwriting. It was the preacher's son's. Hale brought the page to the parsonage the next morning. Reverend Cole took it without speaking, his thumb brushing over the margin. His eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he folded the paper and placed it on his desk. "This," he said quietly, "is private." Hale pressed him. What did it mean? Why would Elijah write such a thing? The preacher only repeated, "It is private." The refusal was telling. In a town where scripture was quoted as easily as greeting a neighbor, the act of withholding felt almost like a confession. But to what, Hale could not yet say. He left the parsonage with the uneasy sense that he was no closer to understanding the events of that night, and that those who might know more had already decided what would and would not be spoken. As the week wore on, the official version of events began to settle like silt in the water. The boy had been troubled, perhaps even sleepwalking, and had somehow found his way to the well. The preacher, grief-stricken, could offer no more detail. The church elders deemed the matter closed. Yet, beneath that smooth surface, Hale could feel the current pulling in another direction. Too many details did not fit. The dry shoes, the missing key, the strange writing, the boy seen near the well at night. On Friday evening, just before dusk, Hale returned to the church alone. He stood at the edge of the well, the iron lid back in place, the lock gleaming in the fading light. He reached out and touched the cold metal, half expecting to feel some trace of warmth as he had with the key. But it was only iron, lifeless, unyielding. Still, as the shadows deepened, he thought he heard something from far below. Not the steady drip of water, but a faint, rhythmic sound. It was almost like the creak of the pulley when the rope turned, slow and deliberate. He stepped back, the hairs rising on his arms, and told himself it was only the settling of stone in the cool of evening. Even so, when he left the yard, he glanced back over his shoulder. The well sat in its place, silent and still, but Hale could not shake the thought that it was watching him. It was the blacksmith, Henry Dobbins, who finally broke the stillness surrounding the well's lock. Hale had gone to his shop under the pretense of repairing a bent stirrup, but in truth he wanted the man's expertise. Dobbins had been the one to fit the iron crossbar decades ago, and if anyone understood the mechanics of the well's seal, it was him. The air inside the smithy was thick with heat and the sharp tang of metal. Sparks spat from the forge as Dobbins straightened from his work, wiping soot from his brow. 2 keys, he said without hesitation, when Hale asked how many could open the lock. Always been that way. 1 for the preacher, 1 for the vestry, and I made them myself, no copies, no spares. You could try to force it, but you'd break the bar before you turned the lock without one of those keys. Hale told him the vestry key was untouched, still hanging in its place. That left the preacher's. Dobbins frowned, his thick hands resting on the anvil. Then either someone got their hands on the Reverend's key, or he opened it himself. His voice was flat, without accusation, but the words carried weight. The sheriff left the smithy with a sour taste in his mouth. The preacher's insistence that the key had been stolen no longer felt like a simple matter of misplacement. It was a choice, an answer given with full knowledge of what it implied. If the key had been taken, why had there been no outcry? No public search? And if it had been returned, as the preacher claimed, why was it wet when Hale found it, as though it had been in the water itself? Late that afternoon, Hale returned to the parsonage. The preacher greeted him at the door, his expression unchanged, though the lines at the corners of his eyes seemed deeper. Hale did not waste words. "I spoke to Dobbins," he said. "You know as well as I do. If that lock was opened, it was done with one of those two keys, and one of them has been in the vestry the whole time." For a moment, the Reverend said nothing. Then he stepped aside, gesturing Hale inside. They entered the study, where the Bible still lay open on the desk, though the page was different now. The preacher closed it slowly, as though marking an end to a thought. "Sheriff," he said, "I understand your duty, but there are matters you cannot approach as you would a stolen horse or a missing coin. Some things belong to the church, not to the law." "This was a boy," Hale said sharply. "Your boy." The preacher's gaze flicked to the mantel, where the key now rested on a small dish. Its brass surface caught the afternoon light, gleaming almost warmly. "There are truths," the Reverend said quietly, "that are heavier than a man can carry in the open. Better they stay in the hands of God." Hale wanted to press him, but the air in the room had shifted. It was as if the conversation had already ended, even though they were still standing there. He turned to go, and as he reached the door, the preacher added, "You would do well not to ask the elders about it. They'll tell you less than I have." The suggestion was as much a warning as it was a dismissal. Outside, Hale stood for a moment on the parsonage steps, staring at the churchyard. The well sat at the far end, the sycamores swaying gently behind it. He could almost imagine Elijah sitting there, head bent, listening. That evening, Hale visited the vestry alone. The key hung from its peg, cool and dry in his hand. He turned it over, noting the faint scratches along the bow, marks from years of use. The teeth were sharp and clean. He replaced it and locked the vestry door behind him, the sound of the bolt echoing in the quiet. The next day, the rumors began. They were small at first, whispered between neighbors or over back fences. One woman claimed she had seen the preacher walking toward the well the night before Elijah's death, though she admitted she was half asleep at the time. Another insisted that the key had never left his possession, that the story of it being stolen was a cover. But the most persistent whisper was that the boy had not gone to the well alone, that someone had been with him. Hale found himself thinking about the hymn book page Samuel had brought him. The deep calls to the deep. The words clung to him, their meaning just out of reach. He returned to the boy's room, searching for any other scraps or notes. The small desk in the corner held little: a slate, a stub of chalk, a few folded handkerchiefs. But in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath an old-school primer, he found a bit of folded cloth. Inside it lay a second scrap of paper, the edges torn as though it had once been part of something larger. On it was a crude drawing, the outline of a key, with a series of small circles drawn inside the bow. Below it, in shaky letters, was written, "Father says it opens more than the well." Hale stared at it for a long time before folding it back into the cloth. He said nothing to the preacher about what he'd found. Instead, he carried it with him, the weight of it pressing against his pocket like a stone. 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, Hale went to the churchyard alone. The well's lid was shut, the lock secure. He knelt beside it, holding his lantern low, and studied the seam where iron met stone. There were faint marks there, not fresh, but not ancient either. A slight wearing, as if the lid had been lifted and replaced many times. He set the lantern down and listened. For a long while, there was nothing. Then, so faint he thought at first it was only the ringing in his ears, came a sound from below, It was not water this time, but something softer, a low, melodic hum. It rose and fell like the breath of someone singing under their breath. Hale stood quickly, scanning the yard, but there was no one. The hum faded, replaced by the usual night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects. Still, his skin crawled. He locked the well's lid again, tested the bar, and left without looking back. The next morning, when he passed the parsonage, the preacher was on the porch, the brass key in his hand. He nodded at Hale as if nothing had changed. But the sheriff could not shake the feeling that the man knew exactly where he had been and what he had heard. It was 3 days after Hale's midnight visit to the well when the hidden journal came to light. It arrived in the sheriff's hands not through official channels, but from a boy barely older than Elijah, a wiry, sharp-eyed lad named Peter Langley, who lingered near the church more than most. Peter found Hale at the edge of the market square, slipping something from under his coat like a thief passing contraband. It was a small leather-bound book, the kind that could be slipped easily into a pocket. The cover was worn smooth, the clasp bent from years of use. "I was supposed to give this to him," Peter whispered, jerking his chin toward the church, "but he's gone this morning, and I think you ought to see it first." He didn't wait for Hale's questions. He melted into the crowd, leaving the sheriff with the book in his hands. Hale took it back to his office and shut the door. The journal smelled faintly of damp paper and something else, oil, maybe, or the faint tang of the well's cold water. The first pages were ordinary enough, neat entries in Elijah's careful hand, recording small events, chores completed, passages from sermons, verses copied out as practice. But midway through, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew tighter, as if each word had been pressed harder into the page. "They don't hear it," one entry began, "but I do. At first I thought it was the wind in the trees, but the wind doesn't call my name. The water does." Another entry. "It told me where the key is." Not the one on the wall, the other one, the one Father keeps in the box. The pages that followed were stranger still. Lists of numbers, some in neat columns, others scrawled across the margins. Rough sketches of the well's stone mouth from above, arrows pointing downward. Phrases repeated. "After the bells. When it's quiet. Bring the key." On one page, a single sentence filled the space. "It isn't deep enough yet." Hale felt a prickle at the base of his neck. He turned to the final entries. The writing was more erratic now, the ink darker in places as if the pen had paused too long. "Father says it's the only way, that I must be made clean, made safe, that the water will take what it needs and leave the rest. I don't think he's lying, I just don't think he knows what's down there." The last page held only one line, written in a hand so shaky it looked like a different person entirely. "If I don't come back, tell them it was Father's choice." Hale sat for a long time with the journal open on his desk. The implications pressed in on him like a weight. If the words were true, the preacher had not only known Elijah's intentions, but had guided them. And if he had done that, then the question was not whether the boy's death had been an accident. It was why. He slipped the journal into a drawer, locking it before leaving the office. His first thought was to confront the preacher, but instinct told him that would drive the man further into silence. Instead, he sought out Peter Langley again, finding him near the livery. The boy was reluctant to speak, but Hale's quiet persistence wore him down. "Elijah gave it to me a week before," Peter said, glancing over his shoulder. "Told me not to read it. Said I should hold on to it and if something happened to get it to the right person. I asked him who, and he said I'd know. I guess he meant you." "Did he say why?" Hale asked. Peter shook his head. "Only that the water wanted him. He said it like, like it wasn't just water anymore. That night, Hale sat in the dark of his own home, thinking about those words. He remembered the hum he'd heard from the well, low and steady, like something patient. He thought about the preacher's face when confronted with the key, and the way he had guarded that hymn page as if it were scripture itself. And he thought about the journal's final line, as damning as any testimony could be. The next morning, Hale walked into the church just after sunrise. The preacher was already there, standing at the altar, his hands folded in front of him. "You've been reading things you ought not to," the Reverend said without turning. Hale's jaw tightened. "I've been reading what your boy wanted me to see." "Boys write foolish things," the preacher said. "They dream, they imagine, and sometimes they take the burdens of their fathers and twist them into shadows." "He thought you meant to put him in the well," Hale said, "and you didn't stop him." The preacher finally turned, his eyes sharp, cold in the morning light. "I meant to save him," he said. "There are forces, Sheriff, that you cannot put in your jail, things that pass from father to son, from mother to daughter, like sickness in the blood. The well can take them. It's taken them before." Hale felt the old boards of the floor under his boots, the smell of the place pressing in on him. "And you believe it took whatever you thought was wrong in Elijah?" The preacher's gaze did not waver. It took him. They stood in silence until the bells began to ring, summoning the town to morning prayer. The sound rolled through the empty space, each note stretching long and low. Hale left without another word, the journal's weight still heavy in his mind. He did not know yet how he would use it, only that he could not leave it buried in his desk. That evening, as the last light bled from the sky, he returned to the well. The lid was locked, the bar firm, but he did not touch it. Instead, he stood with his hand on the cold stone, listening. At first, there was only silence, and then a faint echo, almost like a voice carried through water. It said nothing he could make out, but the cadence was familiar. It was the same rhythm as the bells. It was Mrs. Esther Malone who first spoke of the preacher's confession. She was 72, a fixture in the congregation since before Reverend Cole's arrival, known for sitting in the same pew every Sunday and for never missing a meeting of the church sewing circle. Hale found her on her porch that Thursday afternoon, shelling peas into a tin bowl, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her straw hat. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You're not the only one who's heard him speak of it," she said, as if she'd been expecting him. Hale took the chair she offered. The boards creaked under his weight. "Go on." "It was about 3 weeks ago," she began, hands still moving over the peas. "Middle of the week, after the evening service. I'd left my knitting in the pew and went back for it. That's when I heard him. The confessional door was open just enough, and I could see him there alone. No one else in the room. He was on his knees, hands over his face, saying it over and over. It's the only way to save him. Sometimes he said cleanse him, sometimes save him, but always the same words. "Did he see you?" Hale asked. "No," she said, "and I didn't want him to. I left as quiet as I could, but I haven't been able to shake it since, not with the way that boy's been taken." Hale studied her face. There was no tremor in her voice, no sign of invention. "Have you told anyone else?" "Not a soul. You think the elders would hear this from me? They'd call it gossip and sin in the same breath." The words hung between them. Hale thanked her and walked back toward town, the image of the preacher on his knees burning in his mind. It wasn't proof, but it was a piece of the same pattern. The journal's words, the key, the hymn page, and now this confession spoken into empty air. By that evening, The town's undercurrent of rumor had shifted. Stories about Elijah were merging with something older, something that had lived in Nashville long before his death. Hale began hearing talk of the cleansing, whispered as if it were part of the church's hidden rites. An old man at the tavern swore his grandfather had spoken of using the well to keep the line pure when a child was born with strange inclinations or afflictions. A woman claimed her aunt had been taken there as an infant, though she lived to old age. The stories conflicted in detail, but all agreed on one thing: the well was not just for water. Hale brought these whispers to Reverend Cole the next day, more to gauge his reaction than for any hope of admission. The preacher was in the yard, tending to the roses his wife had planted years ago. He paused with the pruning shears in his hand, looking at Hale with an expression that was neither surprise nor anger. "You've been listening to the wrong people," he said evenly. "Every town has its tales. Ours are no different." "Mrs. Malone heard you," Hale said. "She heard you confess." For a moment, the preacher's eyes narrowed, and Hale thought he might see the man's temper break. But instead, the Reverend set down the shears and wiped his hands on his coat. "Mrs. Malone has a good heart, but she is of an age where dreams and waking moments blend. I have nothing to confess, Sheriff, only prayers to offer." It was a careful answer, one that shut the door without locking it. Hale left, but the preacher's calm only deepened his unease. Men who had nothing to hide often bristled at accusations. Those who were guilty sometimes smiled. The next turn came from an unexpected place: the small, crumbling library at the edge of town. Hale had gone there to follow another lead, but as he scanned the dusty shelves, the librarian, Miss Avery, approached with a ledger in her hands. "You've been asking about the well," she said quietly. "I found something." The ledger was a church record from 1846, bound in cracked leather. Inside, alongside lists of baptisms and marriages, were a few brief notes that didn't match the rest. One entry read, "Child presented at the well for the ritual of removal. Witnesses, 2 elders and the preacher. Water accepted." There was no explanation, no detail about what had been removed or what it meant for the child. But there were 3 more entries like it. The last dated 1863, 16 years before Elijah's death. Hale copied the entries into his own notebook. When he left the library, the street seemed narrower, the air heavier. The idea that this practice had been carried out for decades, perhaps longer, made Elijah's death feel less like an isolated tragedy and more like the latest chapter in a long, hidden history. That night, Hale sat in his kitchen with the journal open before him, the lamp burning low. He read the last lines again. It was Father's choice. The preacher had spoken of saving his son. The journal suggested otherwise. And somewhere between the two lay the truth, a choice made in the name of salvation, perhaps, but one that required the boy's life. It was Margaret Cole, the preacher's wife, who confirmed his suspicion, though not in the way he expected. He found her in the parsonage garden the next morning, her hands resting on the handle of a small spade. Her face was pale, her voice even quieter than usual. "I heard him the night before," she said without looking at him. "He told Elijah the water would make him whole, that whatever followed would be God's will. And Elijah, he didn't argue. He just asked if it would hurt." Hale's throat tightened. "Did you try to stop him?" "I told him not to go, but he looked at me as though I was the one who didn't understand, as though he was already gone." She turned then, meeting Hale's eyes. "If you tell them what I've said, they'll call me a liar. They'll say grief has made me weak, but I was there, Sheriff. I heard it." Her words left no room for doubt. The preacher had led his son to that well, whether in belief or in delusion, convinced it was the right thing to do. The law had no place for such a crime. not in Nashville, not in 1879. But Hale knew he could not let it rest. That evening, as the sun set behind the sycamores, the sheriff walked once more to the well. The air was still, the stones cool under his hand. Somewhere in the dark below, water shifted. He thought of the boy's last question. Will it hurt? And the father's answer. He thought of the ledger, the journal, the whispered tales. And he knew that what lay in the well was not just Elijah's body, but the weight of every secret the town had chosen to keep. The decision to seal the well came swiftly, as if the town had been waiting for the excuse. It was announced at a meeting in the church hall on a Monday evening, the air thick with the mingled smell of kerosene lamps and damp wool. The preacher stood at the front, flanked by the elders, his voice steady as he declared the well no longer fit for use. Its purpose has been fulfilled, he said. We will close it to preserve the sanctity of the ground. No mention was made of Elijah, of the key, or of the whispers that had spread like mold in the days since his death. The vote was a formality. Only 2 hands did not rise in agreement, Mrs. Malone's and the sheriff's. Their opposition was noted, then ignored. The work was set to begin the following morning, iron and stone to cover the mouth, cement poured to bind it shut. The task was given to a crew from the edge of town, men less likely to question the order. That night, after the crowd had thinned and the lamps were snuffed, Hale lingered in the churchyard. The moon was high, casting the sycamores as shadows long across the grass. The well sat quiet at the yard's far edge, its iron lid reflecting a pale gleam. He walked to it slowly, each step deliberate, the soft crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. His lantern's light pooled over the lid, revealing the rust in the seams, the worn edges of the crossbar. The lock was there, as always, its brass face dulled by years. He stood over it for a long time, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the faint sigh of wind through the trees. Then, as if stirred by his presence, a sound rose from below, not the hum he'd heard before, but something more distinct, the muffled cadence of words, spoken low and deliberate. He could not make them out, but the rhythm was slow, deliberate, like a prayer. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. Without fully deciding to, Hale crouched and slid the key from his coat pocket. It was not the vestry key. It was the preacher's, taken from the mantel earlier that day when no one was watching. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock, then turned it. The bar lifted with a dull groan, and the lid shifted, the metal scraping stone. The air that rose from the well was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of iron and something sweeter, like rotting flowers. He lowered his lantern until its light reached the water. The surface was black, reflecting the glow in broken fragments. For a moment, it was only water. Then a ripple formed, slow and deliberate, spreading outward until it touched the walls. Something pale moved beneath the surface. Hale's grip on the lantern tightened. The shape resolved into a face, small, round, eyes open and unblinking. Elijah's face. His lips moved, but the sound was swallowed by the water. Hale leaned closer, straining to hear, and thought he caught a single word. Come. The sheriff's breath caught. The reflection shifted, and behind the boy's head, a shadow appeared, an arm, a hand, resting on his shoulder. The hand was large, the fingers long, the skin darkened by the water's depth. It was not holding him so much as steadying him, keeping him in place. The shape behind him did not resolve into a figure, but its presence was undeniable. Hale's instincts screamed at him to close the lid, to lock it, to walk away. Instead, he reached for the rope coiled beside the well. The fibers were damp, frayed in places, but still strong. He tied the lantern to it and began to lower it slowly, the light swinging over the water. The pale face tracked it, the lips still moving in silent rhythm. As the lantern descended, the shadowed hand slid away into the dark, disappearing beyond the circle of light. The rope reached its end before the lantern touched the water. Hale held it there, watching. The boy's face began to blur, the features melting into the ripples, until the reflection was gone and the water was only water again. He pulled the lantern back up, the rope groaning as it wound over the pulley. When the lantern was back in his hands, he replaced the lid and locked it. His hands shook, though whether from fear or something else he could not say. The key felt heavier now, the metal warm against his palm. He walked to the front of the church and placed it on the steps, the cross-shaped bow catching the moonlight. He left it there, knowing the preacher would find it come morning. The next day, the work crew arrived with tools and materials. The townsfolk gathered at a distance, watching as the men pried open the lid for the last time. Hale kept to the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the preacher. The Reverend stood with his hands clasped, his face calm, his gaze never leaving the well. The crew set the iron plate over the mouth, the clang of metal on stone ringing through the yard. They mixed the cement in wheelbarrows, the gray slurry steaming faintly in the cool air. One by one, they poured it into the gaps, sealing the plate to the stone. The sound of it was thick, final. As the last of the cement was smoothed, the preacher stepped forward. He placed one hand on the iron plate, closed his eyes, and murmured something too soft to hear. When he stepped back, the elders moved in to offer brief, solemn prayers. No one else approached. By afternoon, it was done. The well was no longer a well, just a low, sealed mound of stone and iron, its crossbar gone, its purpose erased from the surface. Children would pass it without knowing what it had once held. Visitors would not notice it at all. But Hale knew. As the crowd dispersed, he stayed behind, standing at the edge of the sealed stone. He thought of the face in the water, the hand on the boy's shoulder, the word he thought he'd heard. Come. The sound of it seemed to linger in the air, faint but insistent, as if the well had not been silenced at all. He left the churchyard without looking back, but he could feel it behind him, the sealed mouth breathing in the dark. Years passed, but the memory of Elijah Cole did not fade. Time in Nashville moved on in its slow, deliberate way. New children were born, shops opened and closed, seasons turned over the same cobblestone streets. The well remained sealed at the far edge of the churchyard, the iron plate now dulled by rain and the creeping stain of moss. The cement had cracked in places, but the seal held. To most, it was nothing more than an odd patch of stone, a relic of some forgotten church renovation. Only those who had been there that summer in 1879 knew what lay beneath. The preacher continued his sermons, his voice steady from the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges as if to anchor himself. His hair grayed, his frame stooped, but he never faltered in his duties. He spoke often of salvation, less often of forgiveness, and never of his son. Margaret Cole became more of a shadow with each year, seldom seen outside the parsonage, her health failing slowly until one winter morning she was gone. Her funeral was quiet, the congregation subdued. The preacher stood alone at her graveside, his expression unreadable. Children in town grew up with their own version of the story. They whispered to each other that Elijah still sang from under the church, that if you stood on the iron plate at night, you could feel it hum beneath your feet. Some dared each other to touch it, to lie down with an ear pressed to the cold metal. Most ran off laughing, claiming to hear nothing. But a few came away pale, saying they had heard a single voice, soft and slow, singing a hymn they didn't recognize. Sheriff Hale grew older too, though the well never left his mind. Some nights, walking home past the churchyard, he would stop at the fence and look toward the sealed mound. The sycamores still stood behind it, their branches twisting in the wind. In certain lights, he swore he could see a pale shape moving just beyond the edge of the trees, watching. When he retired from the badge, he left town for a time, but he returned in the autumn of his 64th year. Nashville was larger now, but the church was much the same, and the well was still there. By then, Reverend Cole was an old man, his voice weaker, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of his Bible. His sermons grew shorter, though his eyes retained their sharpness. When Hale saw him, there was no sign of recognition, as if the years had wiped away the memory of their conversations. But when the preacher passed him on the church steps one Sunday, he paused just long enough to say, "It never let go." The words followed Hale for days. On a rainy afternoon, he walked once more to the churchyard. No one was about. The service had ended hours earlier, and the yard was empty, save for the rows of gravestones. The iron plate was slick under the drizzle, the cracks in the cement now wide enough for moss to grow deep. He stood over it, listening. The rain pattered steadily, masking other sounds. But beneath it, so faint he thought at first it was his imagination, came the trace of a hymn. It was not one he knew, not one sung in the church above. The notes were slow, almost mournful, and just out of reach of memory. That night, Hale dreamed of the well. In the dream, it was not sealed, the lid standing open. The water was calm, reflecting the sycamores overhead. Then ripples spread outward, and Elijah's face emerged, pale and still, his eyes fixed on Hale. This time there was no hand on his shoulder, no shadow behind him, only the boy, his lips moving. Hale leaned in, straining to hear. The voice was clear, and the word was the same as before, "Come." When Hale woke, the echo of it was still in his ears. In the spring of the following year, Reverend Cole died quietly in his sleep. The church was packed for his funeral, the air heavy with incense and the sound of hymns. No mention was made of the well. No mention was made of Elijah. The preacher was buried beside his wife in the churchyard, the stone simple and unadorned save for a single verse, "The water and the Spirit." In the weeks after his burial, children began to say the singing from under the church was louder. A few claimed to hear it even during services, a faint harmony to the congregation's voices. The elders dismissed it, but the murmurs grew. Some said it was the preacher's voice now, joined with his son's. Others insisted it was neither, that it was older and that both had been taken. Hale visited the well one final time in the summer of that year. The sun was high, the heat thick, but the stone beneath his hand was cold. He closed his eyes and waited. The hymn came slowly, winding its way up from the dark. It was joined by another voice, lower, steadier, carrying the same tune. And then, just before it faded, a third, a harmony so deep it seemed to vibrate in his bones. When he opened his eyes, the yard was still, the sycamores motionless in the breathless air. He left Nashville soon after, never to return. But the well remained, its seal weathering, its presence unchanged. The townspeople no longer spoke of Elijah or the preacher except in the faintest of whispers, but the children still dared each other to go near the plate, to listen. And every so often someone would swear they heard it, a hymn sung one beat behind the rest, carrying through the stone, the iron, the years. On certain Sundays when the congregation lifted their voices to "Shall we gather at the river?" there were those who claimed to hear that same slow echo, threading through the melody from somewhere deep below. And those who heard it would leave the churchyard uneasy, glancing toward the sycamores as if expecting to see a pale face in the shade, waiting, still singing, for someone to answer.